The sun was just beginning to rise over the ridges of northern Montana when Ryan Drake stepped onto the frost-lined dock of his lakefront property, coffee steaming in his hand. For most people, a lake was a weekend escape or a postcard memory. For Ryan, it was the center of everything. His home sat perched just above the shoreline, built with his own hands nearly 2 decades earlier after his wife passed. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just honest wood, iron fixtures, and the kind of thick glass that muffled the world but let in the wind. His land stretched across 42 acres, hemmed in by pine and brush, and wrapped around the entire southern side of the lake known locally as Barlow's Mirror. The name came from how still the water ran, calm as polished stone in the mornings, reflecting every tree and crow in perfect symmetry. That silence was what Ryan lived for. He wasn't a man who craved conversation. He wasn't broken or angry. He just preferred the company of rustling branches over people knocking on doors. At 67, Ryan had seen what came of clinging to things that were meant to pass. Marriages, youth, careers. He'd been a contractor for most of his life, building other people's dreams while keeping his own modest. His wife had passed quietly, unexpectedly, and in the years that followed, Ryan discovered that solitude wasn't loneliness when you shaped it yourself. His only consistent project now was the restoration of a 26-foot wooden launch named Juliet, a wedding gift from his father-in-law, left to decay in a shed for years. He had spent each spring and summer over the last 6 years slowly bringing it back to life. Every plank he replaced, every brass screw he cleaned, was an act of memory as much as craft. The lake wasn't regulated by the county. Its ownership was a patchwork of private titles, and Ryan's deed, secured and certified, gave him control of the southern half of the water and full rights to his dock and surrounding marshland. It had been that way for decades. Until recently, no one cared. The locals respected the borders. The fishermen stuck to the northern cove. There had been a kind of unspoken rule: leave the man by the trees alone. But everything changed when the new development rolled in 2 years ago. On the far eastern bank, where the land rose into long rolling fields, a company out of Oregon had purchased an old ranch estate and carved it into luxury parcels. Silver Meadows at Barlow Lake, the signs read, white serif letters printed on navy backgrounds posted along the road and the new gatehouse. At first, it had seemed harmless. The houses went up slowly, expensive things with stone veneers and fire pits. Golf carts buzzed along newly paved roads, but along with the development came something else, something quieter and more insidious. The rise of a neighborhood leadership council that decided it would oversee everything that touched the water. They called it a stewardship group, a residence preservation committee. But Ryan knew what it was the moment he saw the first bulletin board go up at the lake's public access point. An unofficial board making very official decisions. The woman at the center of it all was named Karen Mallory, though Ryan had only ever spoken to her twice, both times unpleasant. She was a large woman in every sense. Loud, tall, unapologetic, always dressed in sharp blazers and fitted cardigans that strained at the buttons. She wore perfume you could smell before you saw her, and she spoke like she was reciting from a manual on how to run a town hall meeting. The first time they met, she had approached Ryan on his own dock, uninvited, during one of his late spring cleanups. She had extended a hand with a smile that never reached her eyes and informed him that the lake was under new observation. Ryan hadn't shaken her hand. He told her, without emotion, that she was standing on private property. She laughed and said the lake belonged to everyone now. Since then, the air had changed. At first it was small, posted notices about recommended usage hours for boats, flags tied to reeds near the boundary line, loud music from across the lake that stopped the moment Ryan looked through his binoculars. Then came the letters. Typed notes delivered by courier, unsigned, but unmistakably her tone. We ask that you consider aligning your lake usage with community safety standards. Several residents have expressed concern about chemical runoff from personal watercraft. Noise levels during late evening hours are being monitored for compliance. Each one folded politely and placed in an envelope with no return address. Ryan never responded. He kept them in a drawer, unopened after the third one, not out of fear, but principle. He had paid for this land, built this life, and he had no intention of letting a suburban socialite dictate the pace of his mornings. That morning, as he took a sip of coffee and looked across the fog-misted lake, Ryan noticed something strange. The Juliet, which he had tied just the day before to the dock's end post with reinforced rope, was gone. Not adrift. Gone. The rope dangled into the water, cut cleanly at an angle. A faint oil sheen glistened near the shore. Ryan set his coffee down slowly, his breath rising in a visible plume. He walked down the dock, knees stiff, and peered over the edge. Far below, 20 feet down where the light just touched the rocky bottom, the outline of the Juliet rested like a skeleton. Her bow was cracked against a stone shelf. Her rudder was sheared off. The brass nameplate floated, strangely, just above the waterline, still attached to a bit of wood that hadn't yet sunk. He felt something cold coil in his gut. Not grief, not anger. It was something worse. Clarity. At the end of the dock, near the mooring cleat, a piece of paper had been nailed directly into the wood. It wasn't soaked, it had been placed recently. The wind hadn't even curled its edges. Ryan stepped over and pulled it free, reading the block letters printed in thick black marker. Next time, there won't be a warning. No signature. Just a thumbprint in greasy black beside the message, likely accidental, but smeared with intent. Ryan stood in silence for a long time, the note in one hand, the sound of lapping water beneath him. He didn't panic. He didn't run for the phone or grab a rifle. He walked back to the house, sat down at the kitchen table, and took a deep breath. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was pregnant with warning, with a promise of escalation. Ryan had lived long enough to know when something had changed shape, when a neighbor stopped being annoying and became a threat. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a prank. It was a message, and messages demanded a response, just not the one they were expecting. Ryan didn't sleep that night. He lay in his chair by the window, wrapped in an old flannel blanket, listening to the unfamiliar quiet outside. It wasn't the silence that had unsettled him. It was what it lacked. No frogs croaking near the waterline, no owl calls from the upper tree line. Just stillness, thick and waiting. He knew this kind of silence from job sites decades ago, the kind that settled in right before something collapsed, right before a floor buckled or beam failed and someone got hurt. It was the stillness of tension, of nature holding its breath. By the time dawn stretched its pale fingers across the lake, Ryan had already dressed, brewed a pot of coffee so strong it bit the tongue, and begun mentally organizing his day not by routine, but by response. He started with the local sheriff's substation, a single-building office 15 miles down Route 6. It was manned that morning by a deputy named Henley, young, broad-shouldered, and seemingly allergic to urgency. Ryan explained what had happened, briefly, plainly, and handed over the note along with the pictures he'd printed from his home camera system. The angle didn't show the culprit directly, but it did confirm the timing. Around 2 a.m, shadows moved near the dock, flashlights cut across the water, and there was the faint mechanical sound of metal on wood. Henley took one look at the footage and shrugged, suggesting that it could have been a curious animal, or some teens from across the lake playing around. Ryan didn't argue. He just leaned forward slightly, voice low and even, and asked if Henley would be comfortable calling it vandalism if the boat in question had a nameplate registered with the state and was tied to a licensed dock untitled Private Property. That got Henley's attention. He promised to file a report, though he was careful to mention that, unless there's an eyewitness or more direct proof, nothing actionable's likely to come of it. Ryan thanked him and left. He hadn't expected justice. What he wanted was documentation. On the way back, he stopped at the town clerk's office. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper haircut, had always been cordial to him. Oh, he asked if there had been any recent changes filed concerning the boundaries or designations of Barlow Lake. She pulled out a folder from the bottom of a drawer and flipped through a few forms. "Only what came in from the Eastern Development," she said. Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Anything pertaining to water rights or usage zones?" She paused and pulled another file. There was a request last fall, something about recreational usage protections and eco-rezoning, but it didn't pass committee review. The county never adopted it. She handed him a copy of the form. It was labeled Environmental Realignment Petition, Phase 1. The applicant, Silver Meadows Residential Collective. The signatory, Karen Mallory. Ryan read every line of the form twice. Buried halfway down the page beneath vague language about runoff prevention and migratory bird safety was a proposed clause that would authorize the Oversight Council, headed by Karen's collective, to assess any vessels using the lake for compliance with modern environmental standards. It wasn't law, but it was an attempt. And even though the county rejected it, the implication was clear. She was testing the waters, legally and literally. When he got home, Ryan took the printed petition and pinned it to his workshop corkboard next to the photographs. Then he called the state licensing board and ordered a full copy of the deed survey for his land. He'd had the original paperwork stored in a safe for decades, but he wanted a current record on file from the state, dated and traceable. While on the line, he also asked about water usage rights and whether any new claims had been made regarding shared access to Barlow Lake. The clerk on the other end told him no such claims had been filed or approved. She sounded annoyed, as if she'd fielded similar questions before. That afternoon, Ryan made the first real mistake in weeks. He went for a walk. It wasn't the walk itself that was wrong, it was the direction. He took a northern loop trail that edged up toward the boundary of the Silver Meadows development, a trail he'd used freely for years. It passed through public land and crossed no marked barriers. But about 300 yards in, he saw something new. A waist-high metal post driven into the ground with a reflective strip and a laminated tag zip-tied to the top. It read, "Protected Zone Access Requires Permit." The marker was fresh, the earth around it unsettled and muddy. 10 feet away, another post, then another, forming an invisible line through the brush like a makeshift fence. Ryan turned and headed back, not wanting a confrontation on a trail, but not before snapping photos with his phone. When he returned to his driveway, something else had changed. A sign. Right where his gravel drive met the county-maintained road, a new sign had been hammered into the ground, the post still pale from the fresh cut. It was printed in blue and white, standard font, laminated against the elements. Recreational Waterway Management Area. Access by permit only. No phone number, no agency seal, no signature. Just a sign that looked official to anyone not paying attention. Ryan pulled it from the ground and tossed it into the back of his truck. He didn't need it for the police. He needed it for the pattern. That night, Ryan received mail, not through the mailbox but slid under his workshop door. It was an envelope, unmarked, thick with documents. Inside were 5 typed pages and a map. The map was a scan of the lake and surrounding properties, with the eastern and southern shores shaded in red. The letter wasn't signed, but it used formal language. Your continued independent use of Barlow Lake is under review. As part of a regional effort to establish consistent environmental stewardship, we encourage your cooperation. Phase 2 will include access reassessment. Compliance is voluntary until July 1st. The date was less than 3 weeks away. Ryan sat in the shop, the map spread before him, his hands curled into fists on either side. He knew what was coming. It wasn't just about the lake. It was about consolidation. They weren't just trying to share the water. They wanted to dictate its use. Frame by frame, signature by signature, inch by inch, they were carving out ownership without buying anything. The method was simple. Claim shared interest, post warning signs, wait for resistance, and file complaints. The real fight wouldn't be on his dock, it would be on paper. So that's where he'd answer it, on paper, and in time. By the end of the week, Ryan began noticing more subtle changes around the lake. Not just signs and stakes in the dirt, but behavior, patterns, eyes. He had lived in that cabin long enough to know the pulse of the land. The mornings when the ducks migrated in, the times of day when the deer came down to drink from the marshes, the wind shifts that signaled incoming storms. Now the patterns were off. The mornings were busier than they should have been. Paddleboards and electric kayaks from across the lake floated closer and closer to his side. Their riders always smiled, always waved, and always seemed to be holding phones. Not to film, not obviously, but lifted just high enough to catch more than a glance. One woman even stopped within 20 feet of his dock and loudly remarked to the man with her, "Oh, look, another dock with no inspection sticker. That's got to be addressed." Ryan watched this unfold from his porch, the mug in his hand growing colder by the minute. They weren't trespassing in the legal sense, not yet, but they were getting braver, probing, looking for a reaction. And he knew why. They were waiting for him to snap, to raise his voice, to throw something, to threaten, to give them a moment they could twist and point at. He didn't give it to them. He waved back silently and let them float off. But when they were gone, he went back to the workbench and began drafting a diagram. Not a trap, not a weapon, just a simple rendering of the property lines, the dock layout, the water line. It wasn't for legal defense, it was for clarity, because the moment was coming when precision would matter more than patience. 2 days later, an unfamiliar truck pulled into the end of his gravel drive. A white service vehicle, no markings, clean except for a laminated tag on the dash that read, "Environmental Surveyor." 2 men stepped out. One was tall and thin, in a crisp windbreaker with a clipboard. The other was stockier, younger, and already walking toward the lake before Ryan had even stepped outside. When Ryan called out, the tall one turned and smiled as if this was all routine. "Morning, sir. We're conducting water quality and shoreline impact assessments across the Barlow perimeter. Shouldn't take long." He didn't stop walking. Ryan stepped off the porch and down the path, boots crunching over gravel until he intercepted them at the edge of the yard. "This is private property," he said. "Access to this shoreline requires permission. You didn't get it." The man with the clipboard remained calm, his voice practiced. Under the state's Tier 3 aquatic review process, we're authorized to perform basic visual assessments within the projected zone of ecological concern. Ryan narrowed his eyes. "That would be true," he replied, "if this land were publicly administered. But it's not. I own this shoreline outright. It was deeded before the review zones existed. I've got the paperwork." That gave the man just enough pause for Ryan to add, "You can either turn around now, or I can call the sheriff and report unlawful entry. You're welcome to return with an officer and a court order." The younger man shifted uneasily, muttered something under his breath, and started walking back toward the truck. The clipboard man nodded once, civil but disappointed. As they left, Ryan took a photo of their license plate. He wasn't going to let this one slide into abstraction. Later that evening, while sorting through documents at the kitchen table, Ryan noticed headlights outside. He didn't recognize the car, another compact SUV, newer, dark blue, with a temporary plate. It didn't pull into the drive. It parked just outside on the shoulder of the county road. The driver never got out. The engine idled for 20 minutes. Then the car turned around and drove off. Ryan made a note of the time and checked the exterior cameras. The same SUV had passed by 3 times in the past 48 hours. He didn't sleep much that night either. The following morning, Ryan took a drive into town. Not to speak to the sheriff this time, but to the county planning office. He asked to see any recent permit requests filed by Silver Meadows or their resident collective. The clerk hesitated, then excused herself. She came back 10 minutes later with a folder and a guarded look on her face. Inside were 4 documents, all dated within the past month. One was a request for dock standardization compliance. Another was a proposal for lake-wide safety patrol rotation. The third was a draft initiative to phase out legacy structures incompatible with water conservation. And the last was a formal notice of interest in establishing a unified usage code for all bordering landowners, citing multiple resident concerns regarding environmental strain, vessel waste, and unmanaged shoreline facilities. All of them were signed by Karen Mallory. Ryan asked if any of the documents had passed committee. The clerk shook her head but added something that froze him in place. They haven't passed, but they've been marked for priority review. There's political pressure. Back home, Ryan walked the perimeter of his land twice before stopping near the southern tree line. Something caught his eye, barely visible from the house, almost concealed behind a bush. A new trail had been cut. The underbrush was trimmed just enough to walk through without making noise. And at the end of the path, a small wooden post marked with fluorescent tape leaned at an angle. The trail came from the direction of Silver Meadows. He didn't touch the post. He photographed it, marked the GPS, and flagged the trail entrance with a ribbon of bright orange plastic, the kind he used during construction back in the day. If they wanted to trespass, he was going to make them cross a line they couldn't pretend wasn't there. 3 nights later, his power went out, just for an hour, long enough to trip the security system and reset his automated locks. He checked the breaker, confirmed no storm activity, no fault, nothing internal. The grid feed was steady. Someone had done it from outside, cut a line, tripped a relay, or thrown a switch upstream. It was a warning, not a loud one, not criminal, but precise, calculated. The final straw came the next morning. He walked out to find his mailbox torn open, the hinges snapped, and the box flattened against the gravel like someone had taken a bat to it. Lying in the dust was a copy of the original petition from Silver Meadows, the one he'd received weeks ago. But now it had a fresh message scrawled in red marker across the top. You don't own the water. Time to share. The S in share was stylized into a wave. Ryan didn't react outwardly. He picked up the paper, dusted it off, and carried it inside. But inside, something had shifted. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was a threshold. Something in him had decided. They wanted escalation. They wanted to test his resolve. They wanted to see how far he'd go to defend what was his. They were about to find out. Ryan knew there was no point confronting anyone directly. If he walked up to Karen Mallory's door, she'd spin it into harassment. If he filed another complaint with the county, it would vanish into a file drawer marked property dispute. So he shifted his strategy, not by force, but by function. He made a list, not of names, not of enemies, but of systems. Utilities, land survey offices, environmental boards, county maintenance crews, state-level agencies responsible for waterways. He made phone calls, asked questions without accusation, and requested inspections and documentation wherever he could. When someone asked what prompted his sudden diligence, he simply answered, "Neighbor coordination concerns." That phrase opened doors. It didn't sound angry, it sounded civic. While Silver Meadows tried to nudge him out by proxy, he began fortifying his position with paper, timestamps, and quiet records. It didn't take long to pay off. One of the inspectors from the Department of Water and Soil called him back 3 days later. The man's voice was slow and southern, like he didn't believe in hurrying through thoughts. "Mr. Drake," he said, "we got some inconsistencies between the shoreline zoning files and what your neighbor group's been submitting." Ryan didn't say anything. He just waited. The inspector continued. Turns out some of the revised boundary suggestions were, let's say, optimistic, nothing enforceable, but they were filed under emergency conservation proposals. That's why they got priority status at the planning desk. Ryan leaned forward in his chair. Were they approved? He asked. The man on the phone chuckled. Not even close. In fact, the guy from legal took one look and flagged them for review. Said someone was trying to wedge in private interest through public protocol. That was the break Ryan hadn't expected to come so fast. It wasn't a court ruling, but it was a pivot. The pressure Karen was applying through policy had been noticed, and not kindly. She had pushed too far, too soon, and now the state was aware. Still, Ryan didn't celebrate. He understood timing. If you press when the tide's turning, you get caught in it. Better to stand still and let the current do the work. 2 mornings later, he received a letter not from the county or any legal office but from a local title and mapping company. It was thin, stiff with folded cardstock, and signed by a surveyor named Lorne Miles. Lorne had been quietly asked to draft an updated visual terrain parcel map for Barlow Lake, paid for by Silver Meadows. But something in the request bothered him, so he sent Ryan a courtesy copy of the early draft. It showed the lake with shaded overlay zones marked under review. His property was among them. There was no legal stamp, no certification, just a projection. But that was enough to sound the alarm. Karen's group wasn't waiting for law to change. They were preparing optics in advance, trying to make it look like his land was already contested, already absorbed, already public in spirit if not in fact. That night, Ryan pulled the cover off his old field camera system. It had been sitting in the shed for years, trail cams with motion sensors, the kind he'd used back when poachers used to sneak through in the early 2000s. He reinstalled 3 units along the southern path, 2 along the lower bluff, and 1 at the base of his dock. He didn't want confrontation. He wanted clarity. And more importantly, he wanted proof, in case the day came when something didn't feel like coincidence anymore. By the end of the week, the atmosphere around the lake had thickened. Boats from the eastern side began anchoring closer to his shore, not crossing the boundary but hovering just within eyesight. Voices carried over the water, pointedly louder than needed. At one point, a group of the paddleboarders stopped just offshore and held what they called a water awareness chat, complete with pamphlets about shoreline erosion and invasive species. It wasn't a protest, it wasn't illegal, but it wasn't innocent either. Ryan stood at the edge of his dock, hands in his pockets, watching them laugh and toss around lingo like public duty and shared space. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Because the next morning, he received a second call from the same inspector, this time with more weight in his voice. "We found an internal memo," the man said, "sent around the Silver Meadows HOA board last month. It discussed launching a private security contract for community enforcement on the lake in coordination with the Shoreline Beautification Initiative." Ryan waited. The inspector added, "They used your name twice. Once in reference to non-compliant vessel ownership. Once regarding obstructive resident pattern." That last phrase hung in the air like poison. Ryan thanked the man, hung up the phone, and stepped outside. The sky was clear, the water still, but nothing felt calm anymore. They were preparing to escalate, not with lawsuits or police, but through pressure disguised as protocol. And now he had proof that he was being targeted by name, classified as a problem to be resolved. It wasn't about environmental concern, it wasn't about safety, it was about leverage. Karen and her people were laying the groundwork for removal, not in the legal sense, but in the social, political, and procedural. They wanted to turn his presence into an inconvenience, make the problem so layered that officials would choose convenience over justice, paper over land. So Ryan changed course. That same day, he submitted a formal property integrity claim to the county zoning board, citing unauthorized boundary suggestions and the planting of unofficial survey markers. He attached the courtesy map Lorne had sent and included a cover letter written in plain language. This notice serves to formally challenge any usage assumption related to Parcel 18B, Southern Barlow Lake. The property is privately held. No shared access has been granted. No permissions extended. Then, in a final move, he requested that all future development applications within a quarter-mile of his property be disclosed to him in advance. It was a bureaucratic grenade. It didn't stop development, but it forced everything around him into slow motion. When he was done, he walked to the dock, stared into the water where the Juliet had once floated, and made a quiet decision. He wouldn't rebuild her yet. The boat could wait. What mattered now wasn't memory. It was boundary. Because something had shifted. He was no longer defending a life. He was defending space. And space, once contested, became war. It began with the trash. Not in a metaphorical sense, but literal garbage. 2 full contractor bags dumped at the edge of Ryan's drive just past the tree line, where the shadows stayed thick even after sunrise. It wasn't the bags themselves that bothered him. He'd dealt with worse from tourists years ago. What caught his attention was the contents. Neatly bundled packaging from the Silver Meadows HOA clubhouse, still bearing vendor labels, shipping receipts, and half-drunk cans of low-sodium mineral water, the kind that no one outside a marketing office ever willingly bought. The labels on the trash matched the product line featured at the HOA's last community fair. It wasn't a random dump, it was a breadcrumb trail. They weren't trying to hide, they were trying to provoke, to suggest without accusing, to taunt without consequence. Ryan didn't call anyone about it. He cleaned it himself, took photos, logged the date, and wrote nothing in return. But inside, something cracked. The next strike came 2 days later, more precise, more invasive. Ryan received a notice from the county's Environmental Compliance Office informing him that an anonymous complaint had been filed regarding unpermitted soil alteration near the water line. The letter cited suspected violations of the Riparian Protection Statute and requested that he cease all modification of his shoreline pending an on-site review. The catch? Ryan hadn't touched the shoreline in months. The only recent changes were the weeds he cleared by hand after the flooding last spring, a task entirely within his rights. But the complaint had been filed with enough specificity, enough insider phrasing, that the department had to follow up. He was being baited into a fine, or at least into allowing strangers onto his land. Rather than comply immediately or resist outright, Ryan did what he always did when cornered. He documented. He printed every permit he'd ever filed, photographed the shoreline from every angle, annotated the images, dated them, and mailed a packet to the compliance office along with a calm letter. No anger, no accusations, just facts. The dates, the boundaries, the actions taken, and a copy of the most recent satellite imagery showing nothing altered, nothing added. He concluded the letter with a sentence he knew would land exactly as intended. Should your review team require on-site confirmation, please be advised that access to Parcel 18B must be preceded by an appointment and mutual acknowledgement of the right to refuse entry without warrant. The response came back within 4 days. Review postponed indefinitely, no further action pending. But the pressure didn't stop. That weekend, Karen Mallory hosted an impromptu shoreline cleanup and education day at the Eastern Inlet, just across from Ryan's dock. Families gathered, tents were pitched, and speakers were brought in to deliver short lectures about lake ecology, invasive species, and historic patterns of obstruction by legacy landowners. It wasn't subtle. One of the guest speakers, a man introduced as an aquatic usage consultant, gave a speech about how privatized water bodies stifle community health and create ecological imbalance. Ryan watched the whole thing from a lawn chair on his porch, the same mug in hand, a scoped camera resting quietly in his lap. He wasn't filming. He wasn't threatening. He was simply observing. But when Karen took the mic herself and began citing statistics about non-participating residents and shoreline monopolizers, he made a quiet mental note. This was no longer about water. This was a campaign, and like any campaign, it needed an enemy. The following Monday, Ryan came home from a short supply run to find his private road partially blocked. A large landscaping trailer, unmanned and unmarked, had been left half-parked across the narrow entry. It wasn't accidental. Its tires were deliberately angled into the gravel, just enough to dig ruts. The hitch lock had been secured and no vehicle was attached. Ryan had to reverse his truck 100 feet down the hill and cut through an old utility trail just to reach his own home. When he returned to inspect the trailer, he found nothing inside, no tools, no gear, just a clipboard sitting on the wheel, with a sign-in sheet labeled Wildlife Buffer Audit. The names were fake. The dates were blank. But the message was real. This wasn't an intrusion anymore. It was a siege, slow and incremental, masked behind paperwork, committees, and friendly smiles. Ryan didn't retaliate. He called the county road commissioner, filed a formal obstruction report, and submitted the license plate to the DMV for ownership confirmation. But he also began preparing for what he now understood was inevitable. He reached out to a local fire code inspector, someone he'd worked with years ago on a renovation project in town, and asked a pointed question: whether a structure built within 20 feet of an unprotected slope, lacking dual egress and equipped with a gas line but no exterior ventilation, could be flagged for conditional suspension. The inspector said yes, if documented and photographed. Ryan asked no further questions. He simply thanked the man and scheduled a general inquiry inspection for a nearby address, the Silver Meadows Community Clubhouse. Meanwhile, he returned to his own property with renewed focus. He reinforced the edge of his dock using permitted materials. He marked every tree within 20 feet of his water line with survey tags. He double-posted his no trespassing signs, added reflective coating, and installed motion-triggered lighting along the trail that Karen's group had been using to sneak observation points. He wasn't building a wall. He was illuminating the battlefield. One night, just past 2 a.m., the trail cameras snapped 3 consecutive images. 3 figures in dark clothing, carrying what appeared to be a rolled tarp and a bucket, crossed the lower trail and stepped onto his shoreline. They didn't stay long, maybe 10 minutes. But when Ryan inspected the site the next morning, he found a pile of raw fish guts dumped near the base of his dock. It wasn't random. It wasn't wildlife. It was staged. The smell alone was enough to attract coyotes, raccoons, and God knew what else. But what chilled him more was what lay beneath the pile: a child's plastic whistle, bright yellow, still intact. He took it as a message, whether from the HOA or some lunatic acting under their umbrella didn't matter. The implication was the same. He was being told to back down, or chaos would follow. That night, Ryan wrote his own letter, not to the HOA, not to Karen, but to the state's Office of Administrative Hearings. He filed a request to initiate a formal conflict mediation under the State Adjoining Lands Dispute Resolution Act. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't even an accusation, but it forced the state to assign an observer to begin collecting filings and testimony. It created a paper trail with weight. He also included copies of every incident: the garbage dump, the trailer, the fish, the altered survey maps, the guest speaker transcript, and the boundary images. And lastly, the photos of the fake audit sheet left in the trailer. The final attachment was a single sentence typed in bold: "Resident of Parcel 18B hereby requests a third-party review of Silver Meadows coordination activities on the grounds of sustained non-consensual pressure, obstruction, and unsanctioned territorial influence." By sending that letter, Ryan crossed a threshold of his own. No more reacting. No more documenting. Now it was formal. Now it was procedural. They wanted bureaucracy. He gave them fire wrapped in it, because the moment was no longer about a boat or even a shoreline. Now it was about the right to draw a line and have it mean something. The morning the letter arrived, the air felt wrong. Ryan had woken before sunrise as usual, made his coffee, checked the trail camera footage, and gone outside to walk the ridge. There had been no sounds on the lake, no early paddlers, no ducks skimming the surface. Only stillness. When he returned to the porch, a white envelope lay pinned under a river stone on the top step. No address, no name. Just thick cardstock folded with mechanical precision. He opened it slowly. Inside were 3 sheets. The first, a printed notice bearing the letterhead of the Regional Zoning Compliance Office, except the font was wrong and the signature space was blank. The second sheet was a map, nearly identical to the courtesy draft he'd been given by the surveyor, but now marked with a stamped header. Approved pending integration. And the third, a personal note, handwritten in firm block letters. You've made this harder than it needed to be. Consider this the last phase. Ryan sat with the document spread across the table. He didn't speak, didn't move for several minutes. The paper wasn't official. The stamp was a copy-paste from an older document. It was a fabrication, but one with just enough polish to fool someone who wasn't paying attention. That made it more dangerous. It meant whoever delivered it wasn't just posturing anymore. They were trying to create alternate reality. Documents, maps, notices, signs, until the false world replaced the real one through repetition and submission. It wasn't a land grab. It was a narrative war. And this, Ryan understood with final clarity, was the point at which resistance wasn't enough. He spent that afternoon on the phone, not with lawyers, not with officials, but with the last few remaining people he trusted from his contracting days. Men who still had access to heavy machinery, men who weren't afraid of the paperwork but didn't hide behind it either. He didn't tell them everything. He didn't need to. "I've got a short-term job," he said. "Need a loader and a dozer. Something that can move concrete and tear out a slab. Can't pay union rates, but I can pay fast." 2 of them said yes without asking further questions. The machines arrived at 5 the next morning, delivered to a staging site a mile down the ridge on a friend's disused lot. Ryan signed the drop-off slip, ran diagnostics, and checked the fuel levels himself. No logos, no markings, just steel and diesel and purpose. By noon, he had submitted a request to the county building office to initiate a complaint review of the Silver Meadows clubhouse under fire safety and utility code standards. The basis: suspicious propane routing, unverified egress, slope vulnerability, and lack of compliant storm runoff containment. These weren't lies. He had the photos. He had the time-stamped reports. The county would respond in 2 to 3 days. But that wasn't the plan. The paperwork wasn't to stop them. It was to follow him, so that after what came next, everything that happened could be traced to the paper, not the man. He waited until Thursday. They were holding their regular community meeting that day, a quarterly affair that included light catering, welcome speeches, and updates on ecological beautification efforts. Karen would be there. She never missed them. She hosted them. Ryan, dressed in his work clothes, old denim, steel-toed boots, and a battered canvas jacket. He didn't bring tools. He didn't bring a weapon. He brought one thing: a laminated copy of the original deed to Parcel 18B, signed and notarized before half the people in that development were born. He drove the loader up first, slow and steady, headlights off. The noise echoed down the private road before the machine came into view. Conversations halted. Phones came out. Karen stepped onto the steps of the clubhouse in a pastel blue sweater, holding her clipboard like it could shield her from physics. She raised her voice, something about private property, safety, police. Ryan didn't stop. He parked the loader 20 feet from the main entrance, turned off the engine, climbed down, and without speaking, walked around to the dozer parked behind it. He turned the key and let it idle for 30 seconds. The engine rumbled like a storm cloud trapped in steel. Karen shouted again, something about consequences, litigation, community rights. Ryan revved the throttle once, then put the blade down. He advanced 20 feet in 12 seconds. The blade caught the corner of the building. Not the front, not where people stood, but the side where the concrete slab connected to the utility room. The wall crumpled with a sound like tearing aluminum. Dust plumed. A scream rang out from someone inside. The glass exploded inward. Ryan didn't stop. He pushed forward until the blade embedded into the slab itself, dragging metal and insulation behind it like shredded skin. Then he backed up, turned off the machine, and climbed down. Silence followed, except for the creaking of stressed beams and the distant sound of alarms that hadn't been triggered by any system, only by the people now panicking with their phones and whispered legal threats. Karen's face was white with fury, or fear, or both. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Ryan walked to the edge of the broken wall, reached into the pocket of his coat, and pulled out the laminated deed. He dropped it on the concrete, now littered with fragments of their fake world. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You tried to erase me on paper. I answered in stone." He walked away without being stopped. No one touched him. No one blocked the road. And as he got into his truck and drove back down the ridge, the sirens had not yet arrived. Not police, not fire, not anyone who mattered, because the damage was done, and not just to the building. It was done to the illusion. For months, Karen and her people had tried to create a story in which Ryan Drake was a squatter, a barrier, a bitter old man clinging to outdated property rights. But now, that narrative had holes in it. Holes shaped like crushed cinder block and torn fiberglass. And no one could pretend otherwise. That night, Ryan sat on his porch in the quiet. He didn't drink. He didn't replay the event in his mind. He just watched the stars appear over the lake one by one, like they always had. Because some things couldn't be reclassified, rezoned, or rewritten. Some lines stayed exactly where they were drawn. 3 weeks passed and the clubhouse remained closed. Yellow tape looped around its collapsed wing like a tourniquet on a limb no one was sure how to treat. The county inspector's report, once finally made public, cited gross non-compliance with slope regulation, improper propane storage, and lack of sufficient egress in the event of fire or structural collapse. That alone would have warranted immediate shutdown. But the pictures told their own story: gaping drywall, twisted rebar, the broken skeleton of a meeting hall that had once echoed with the voice of Karen Mallory. Ryan didn't attend the hearing that followed. He didn't need to. His name was barely mentioned. The official record listed the incident not as vandalism, not as protest, but as unauthorized structural interference during an ongoing compliance investigation. The kind of phrasing you get when officials know they waited too long to act and needed the ending to be bloodless. Karen resigned from her position the day after the county board issued their preliminary decision. No press release. No farewell. She simply didn't show up for the next meeting, and no one asked why. Ryan heard she'd moved out 2 weeks later, her Lakeview home listed under a shell property trust with a realtor 2 towns over. Her name disappeared from every HOA memo. Her allies lost steam. The voices that once echoed with crusading optimism about community standards and beautification efforts quieted like wind dying down after a storm snaps the weather vane off the roof. No one came to Ryan's property after that. The signs remained up, but they were no longer challenged. The trail through the woods vanished beneath new growth. The dock stayed quiet. Ryan didn't rebuild the Juliet. Not yet. The lake was finally still again, and he didn't want to disturb that peace. not with engines or plans or even memories. Instead, he spent his time replacing the mailbox they'd smashed, repaneling the side of the cabin where weather had warped the cedar, and restacking the stone boundary markers at the edge of the property with fresh mortar. Not for legal clarity, for permanence. He still walked the ridge every morning, still brewed the same bitter coffee, still stared out over the water like it might speak back. But something in his posture had changed. Not heavier, not harder, just grounded in a way that didn't need defending. People in town began to treat him differently, though no one said anything directly. At the feed store, the man behind the counter nodded with more weight in his jaw. At the post office, the clerk who used to rush him now waited patiently. Once, at the diner, a couple from Silver Meadows, he recognized them from one of the paddleboards, paid for his coffee without leaving a name. He didn't chase them down. He didn't offer thanks. The gesture wasn't about forgiveness. It was acknowledgement, maybe even apology. But he hadn't done it for that. He hadn't done it for pride, or legacy, or spectacle. He had done it because at some point when no one else stands where they should, someone has to dig in and say, "This is the line, and I remember where it was drawn." Summer came late that year, the heat rising gently like steam instead of fire. The lake, still mostly empty on weekdays, shimmered with an honesty it hadn't held for years. The signs around the public access point were taken down, not vandalized, just quietly removed one by one until the fence itself had no message to convey. A small notice appeared on the county site 3 months after the incident. The Silver Meadows Shoreline Collective has been dissolved following restructuring of the Residential Oversight Agreement. Ryan read it once, printed it for the file, drawer, and let it go. He never raised his voice, never filed a single formal grievance, never threatened a soul. But when they came with paper to erase him, he brought iron to answer. And when the dust settled, what was left wasn't a war zone or a battlefield. It was just a man on his land, still standing where he always had, unchanged and unmoved. Because there are places in this country where law means less than intent, where process bends under pressure, and where people like Karen Mallory rise fast and loud until they meet someone who doesn't move. Ryan Drake didn't win anything. He didn't need to. He just kept what was his. And when the breeze returned to the water, it carried no voices, only reflection.